I never thought I'd be the villain of my own story. For decades, I told myself I was the hero, the one who made the hard decisions, the one who saw what others couldn't see, the one who protected what we'd built. But that's the thing about being the villain. You never recognize yourself as one. You dress up your cruelty in the language of necessity. You call your betrayal strategy. You look at the person you destroyed and convince yourself they left you no choice. My name is Marcus Brennan, and I systematically cheated my business partner out of everything we built together. Not through some moment of passion or a single desperate decision, but through a cold, calculated campaign that lasted 18 months. I dismantled a 20-year friendship. I rewrote history. I made a good man look like a criminal. And for 6 years, I lived with the spoils of that betrayal, telling myself I deserved every penny, every accolade, every moment of success. This is my confession. Not because I'm looking for forgiveness, I forfeited that right long ago, but because the truth has a weight that compounds over time, and I've been carrying mine until my spine has started to bend under the load. Someone needs to know what really happened. Someone needs to understand how a decent person, and I was decent once, can transform into someone capable of destroying the person they loved most in this world. It started with Daniel Whitmore. Danny. If you'd asked me 25 years ago who I'd trust with my life, I wouldn't have hesitated. Danny wasn't just my business partner. He was the best man at my wedding. He was the godfather to my daughter. He was the person I called at 2 a.m. when my father died, and he drove 3 hours through a snowstorm to sit with me in that hospital chapel while I fell apart. We built Meridian Solutions together from nothing, literally nothing, just 2 desks in my garage and a belief that we could create something that mattered. And I took it all from him. Every share, every client relationship, every ounce of reputation. I left him with nothing but questions and a fraud investigation that nearly put him in prison. The part that haunts me most isn't what I did. It's why I did it. Because the truth is, Danny never betrayed me. The evidence I thought I had, the conspiracy I was certain I'd uncovered, it was all a lie. Not his lie. Mine. I created a story to justify my own greed, and I believed it so completely that I became its most devoted evangelist. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the version of myself I barely recognize anymore. It was 1999 when Danny and I launched Meridian. We were both 26, fresh out of graduate school, convinced we could revolutionize how mid-sized companies handled their supply chain logistics. Danny was the visionary. He could see patterns in data that looked like chaos to everyone else, could understand what businesses needed before they understood it themselves. I was the operator, the one who could take Danny's brilliant ideas and translate them into systems, processes, client relationships. We were a perfect partnership. I mean that without exaggeration. For 15 years, Meridian grew steadily, thoughtfully. We never chased explosive growth at the expense of our values. We never took on investors who would pressure us to compromise. By 2014, we had 73 employees, revenue of about $42 million, and a reputation in our industry that opened every door. More importantly, we still genuinely liked each other. We still had dinner together every Friday night with our wives. We still trusted each other completely. At least, I thought we did. The shift began so gradually that I couldn't have pinpointed its origin if you'd asked me at the time. Looking back now, I can trace it to the summer of 2015, when Meridian landed its biggest contract yet, a 3-year engagement with Hartwell Manufacturing that would nearly double our revenue. It should have been our greatest triumph. Instead, it became the seed of everything that followed. The Hartwell deal changed the dynamics of our partnership in ways I didn't immediately understand. For the first time in our history, we needed to bring in significant outside expertise. We hired 12 new consultants in 6 months. We opened a second office in Chicago, and Danny, whose genius had always been in the conceptual realm, found himself increasingly out of his depth in the operational complexity we'd created. I didn't handle that well. I should have supported him, should have recognized that his skills and mine were complementary, not competitive. Instead, I started keeping score. I noticed when clients praised my work specifically. I tracked which new hires gravitated toward me versus toward Danny. I began to see our partnership not as a collaboration, but as a competition I was quietly winning. That was the first betrayal, not of Danny, but of myself. I betrayed the person I'd been, the person who understood that success shared is success multiplied. And once I'd made that internal shift, once I'd started viewing Danny as a rival rather than a partner, everything else became possible. The specific catalyst came in October of 2016 during a quarterly review of our finances. I'd always handled the high-level strategy while our CFO, a woman named Patricia Oduya, managed the operational details. But Patricia had taken a leave of absence to care for her sick mother, and her temporary replacement was a young accountant named Brian Holcomb, who had neither Patricia's experience nor her discretion. Brian came to me with what he called irregularities. He'd noticed a series of payments, totaling about $400,000 over the previous 18 months, that he couldn't reconcile against any clear deliverables. They'd been authorized by Danny, processed through accounts Danny controlled, and paid to a consulting firm called Nexus Strategic Partners. I remember the moment Brian showed me those records. I remember the cold feeling that spread through my chest, the way my vision seemed to narrow. I asked Brian if he'd mentioned this to anyone else. He said no. He'd come to me first because he wasn't sure what to make of it. I told him I'd look into it personally, that there was probably a simple explanation, that he should focus on his other responsibilities while I investigated. Then I did something I'd never done before in 20 years of partnership. I started investigating Danny without telling him. I wish I could explain the psychology of what happened next, but even now, I don't fully understand it. I think some part of me had been waiting for permission to distrust Danny, waiting for evidence that would justify the competitive resentment I'd been nurturing for months. When Brian handed me those financial records, something clicked into place. Not a revelation of truth, but a key turning in a lock I'd been building toward all along. I became obsessed with Nexus Strategic Partners. I researched them online and found almost nothing. A bare-bones website, no client testimonials, no identifiable principles. To my increasingly suspicious mind, this wasn't a limitation of my research skills. It was proof of a shell company designed to siphon money from Meridian without detection. Over the following weeks, I dug deeper. I accessed Danny's email through a shared server backup system that technically gave me administrative rights. I found correspondence between Danny and someone named Michael Chen, discussing Phase 2 implementation and maintaining discretion until the board presentation. I found references to meetings that hadn't appeared on our shared calendars. I found a trail that seemed to lead inexorably toward a conclusion I was already primed to reach. Danny was stealing from us. Danny was building something behind my back. Danny had been lying to me for at least a year, maybe longer. Here's what I understand now that I couldn't understand then. I was interpreting ambiguous evidence through the lens of my own suspicion, finding confirmation for beliefs I'd already formed. The human mind is extraordinarily good at constructing narratives that justify its emotional conclusions. Once I believed Danny was betraying me, every piece of evidence became proof of that betrayal, regardless of what it actually demonstrated. But in that moment, in those weeks of private investigation, I felt like a man who'd finally seen through an elaborate deception. I felt righteous. I felt hurt. And increasingly, I felt something darker, a cold determination to protect myself and our company from someone who'd revealed himself as untrustworthy. I decided I needed professional help. Not the kind of professional help I actually needed. A therapist, a trusted mentor, someone who could have helped me examine my assumptions before acting on them. Instead, I hired a private investigator, a man named Warren Foley, who came recommended by a lawyer I'd worked with on a litigation matter years earlier. Warren was excellent at his job, which in retrospect was the worst possible outcome. He found more. He always found more. He documented Danny's meetings with Michael Chen, meetings that took place in restaurants, in hotel lobbies, in a private office suite that Nexus Strategic Partners rented downtown. He photographed Danny reviewing documents, shaking hands, smiling in ways that suggested a relationship far more developed than I'd imagined. Warren also discovered that Michael Chen had previously worked for Hartwell Manufacturing, the same Hartwell that represented our biggest client engagement. To Warren, and therefore to me, this was evidence of a kickback scheme. Danny was funneling Meridian resources to a fake consulting company run by a Hartwell insider, presumably in exchange for preferential treatment on the contract. I remember the night I sat in my study, spreading Warren's photographs across my desk like playing cards in a losing hand. My wife Catherine found me there at 2 a.m, asked me what was wrong. I lied to her. I said I was stressed about a client issue, nothing serious. I'd started lying to Catherine by then, had already begun constructing the wall of deception that would eventually contribute to the end of our marriage. But that's another story. Another confession I may never have the courage to make. What I told myself that night looking at those photographs was that I had no choice. Danny was going to destroy everything we'd built. He'd already compromised our relationship with our biggest client. If this became public, if regulators got involved, Meridian would be finished. 73 employees would lose their jobs. Everything we'd sacrificed for 2 decades would evaporate. I wasn't betraying Danny, I told myself. I was saving the company from Danny's betrayal. The plan took shape over the following months with a precision that still disturbs me when I think about it. I've always been good at strategy, good at seeing how complex systems can be manipulated toward desired outcomes. I turned that gift toward destroying my best friend, and I executed the plan with the same methodical care I'd brought to building our business. Step 1 was isolation. I began subtly undermining Danny's relationships with key clients and employees. Nothing overt. I was far too careful for that. A raised eyebrow when someone praised Danny's work. A gentle suggestion that perhaps Danny was distracted lately, that maybe his heart wasn't fully in the company anymore. I planted seeds of doubt that grew in the dark, taking root in the minds of people who trusted me implicitly because I'd never given them reason not to. Step 2 was documentation. I started creating a paper trail that would support the narrative I planned to eventually present. I asked Brian Holcomb to flag any further irregular transactions, framing my request as routine financial oversight. I instructed our IT department to enhance our monitoring of the shared server, citing vague concerns about security, but really ensuring that Danny's emails were being archived in ways that would be admissible as evidence. I was building a case brick by brick, and Danny had no idea the walls were rising around him. Step 3 was legal positioning. I met quietly with an attorney, not our corporate counsel, but an outside lawyer who specialized in partner disputes. I described the situation, painting Danny as a potential criminal and myself as a reluctant whistleblower. The attorney advised me that if fraud was occurring, I had both the right and the fiduciary duty to protect the company's interests. He walked me through the process of forcing out a partner, of restructuring ownership, of containing the damage that a scandal might cause. Step 4 was the hardest and the most calculated. I needed Danny to do something that would justify immediate action. I needed him to make a mistake I could use. I engineered an opportunity for exactly that. I asked Danny to take the lead on renewing our Hartwell contract, knowing that this would bring his relationship with Michael Chen into sharper focus. I watched as Danny scheduled meetings with Hartwell executives, as he prepared presentation materials, as he navigated the negotiation with what I now recognize was genuine skill and dedication. And then I arranged for those negotiations to fail. I've never told anyone this before. It's the part of my confession that I've struggled most to put into words, because it reveals not just betrayal, but active sabotage. I leaked confidential pricing information to a Hartwell competitor, making it appear as though the leak had originated from Danny's communications. I planted questions in the minds of Hartwell's procurement team about the integrity of our engagement. I created enough doubt to derail a contract renewal that would have been the crowning achievement of Danny's career. When Hartwell walked away from the negotiating table, I had my ammunition. Danny had failed at the most important task he'd ever been assigned. Combined with the financial irregularities I'd been documenting, Combined with the suspicions I'd cultivated among our leadership team, I had everything I needed. The confrontation happened in March of 2017. I called a special meeting of our board. 4 outside directors who respected me, trusted me, and had been carefully primed over the preceding months to view Danny with skepticism. I presented my evidence: the payments to Nexus, the connection to Michael Chen and Hartwell, the failed contract renewal, the pattern of behavior that suggested, when viewed through the lens I'd constructed, a partner who'd been systematically betraying the company for personal gain. Danny was blindsided. I can still see his face when I laid out my accusations: the confusion, the disbelief, the growing horror as he realized what I was claiming. He tried to explain. He said Nexus Strategic Partners was a legitimate consulting firm that specialized in supply chain innovation. He said Michael Chen was a brilliant strategist he'd been working with to develop new service offerings for our clients. He said the payments were for real work, authorized through proper channels, and that he'd been planning to present the results to the board at our next quarterly meeting. But by then, it was too late. I'd spent months building a narrative, and his explanation, however truthful, sounded exactly like what a guilty person would say. The board voted to suspend Danny pending a full investigation. They appointed me as sole managing partner with immediate authority over all company operations. They referred the matter to outside counsel for review and potential referral to law enforcement. Danny looked at me across that conference table with something I've never forgotten. It wasn't anger, though, that came later. It was confusion, genuine, heartbreaking confusion. He didn't understand how his best friend, his partner of 20 years, could believe these things about him. He didn't understand because he couldn't, because the Danny I was describing wasn't the Danny he knew himself to be. I should have paused in that moment. I should have seen his confusion and recognized it for what it was, not the performance of a caught criminal, but the genuine bewilderment of an innocent man. But I was too far down my path. I'd convinced myself so thoroughly of Danny's guilt that his protestations only reinforced my certainty. Of course he'd deny it. Of course he'd try to explain it away. That's what guilty people do. The investigation that followed lasted 6 months and cost nearly $300,000 in legal and forensic accounting fees. Our outside counsel interviewed dozens of witnesses, reviewed thousands of documents, traced every payment and every email I'd flagged as suspicious. They found nothing: no evidence of fraud, no criminal conduct, no kickbacks or self-dealing. Nexus Strategic Partners was, exactly as Danny had claimed, a legitimate consulting firm that specialized in cutting-edge supply chain methodologies. Michael Chen was, exactly as Danny had claimed, a brilliant strategist who'd left Hartwell Manufacturing to start his own practice. The work they'd done for Meridian was real, was valuable, and would eventually form the foundation for a service line that generated tens of millions of dollars in revenue that I claimed and Danny never saw. But by the time those findings emerged, the damage was irreversible. Danny's reputation had been shattered by 6 months of rumors and innuendo. Our employees had chosen sides, and most had chosen mine, because I was still there, still running the company, still controlling the narrative. Our clients had been carefully reassured that the situation was under control, that Danny was no longer involved in operations, that Meridian remained a stable and trustworthy partner. The legal investigation might have cleared Danny of criminal conduct, but it couldn't restore what I'd taken from him: his relationships with our employees, his credibility in our industry, his share of the company we'd built together. I used the investigation itself as a weapon. I argued that Danny's actions, even if not technically criminal, had created such damage to the company that his continued involvement was impossible. I pointed to the lost Hartwell contract, conveniently omitting my role in its failure. I emphasized the disruption and expense of the investigation, as if Danny had caused rather than suffered through it. I presented a buyout offer that valued his shares at a fraction of their true worth, arguing that the company's reputation, and therefore its value, had been irreparably damaged by the scandal. Danny fought. Of course he fought. He hired his own lawyers, challenged the valuation, demanded an independent assessment. But litigation is a war of attrition, and I had resources he didn't. I had control of the company's cash flow. I had relationships with the banks that provided our credit facilities. I had 6 months of head start in shaping how our industry perceived the dispute. After 18 months of legal battle, Danny settled. He accepted roughly 12 cents on the dollar for his share of a company worth, at that point, approximately $60 million. He walked away with less than $4 million, half of which went to his attorneys. Meanwhile, I emerged with controlling interest in a company that was, despite everything, continuing to grow. I'd won, completely and utterly. I'd taken everything Danny had, everything we'd built together, and I'd kept it for myself. For a while, I told myself I'd done the right thing. Even as the investigation cleared Danny, I clung to my suspicions. I convinced myself that the forensic accountants had missed something, that Danny had covered his tracks more effectively than I'd realized. I took his settlement as proof of guilt. Why would an innocent man accept such an unfavorable deal unless he knew, at some level, that he'd done something wrong? It's remarkable, the stories we tell ourselves to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. I built an elaborate internal mythology around my betrayal, casting myself as the vigilant protector, the leader who'd made painful but necessary choices. I repeated this story so often that it became indistinguishable from memory. I genuinely believed it, for years. The unraveling began, as these things often do, with something small. It was the spring of 2022, 5 years after Danny's departure, and I was reviewing old files as part of a technology migration. We were moving our archives to a new cloud system, and the process required me to categorize and authorize the transfer of legacy documents. I found emails I'd forgotten about, correspondence between Danny and Michael Chen that I'd skimmed during my investigation but never read carefully because by that point I'd already reached my conclusions. Reading them now, with 5 years of distance and the absence of the fear and paranoia that had clouded my judgment, I saw them differently. Danny wasn't hiding anything. The emails were professional, enthusiastic, and completely transparent. He talked about surprising me with the new service line. He talked about how excited he was to show the board what he'd developed. He talked about me specifically, about how proud I'd be, about how this would cement Meridian's leadership in our industry, about how we'd celebrate together when the announcement was made. He was planning a gift. Danny had spent 18 months working with Michael Chen, spending company money with proper authorization to develop something remarkable. And he'd kept it quiet because he wanted to surprise his partner, his best friend, with evidence of how much he still cared about our shared vision. I destroyed him for trying to give me a gift. That realization didn't come all at once. It crept up on me over days and weeks, as I read more of the old files, as I traced the timeline of events with clearer eyes. I started remembering things I'd buried, the look on Danny's face during that board meeting, his attempts to explain, his genuine confusion at my accusations. I remembered the Friday night dinners we'd stopped having, the phone calls he'd made that I'd refused to answer, the letter he'd sent after the settlement that I'd thrown away without reading. I became obsessed with reconstructing the truth I'd refused to see. I tracked down Michael Chen, who was still running Nexus Strategic Partners and doing well. I asked if he'd meet with me, and after some hesitation, he agreed. I sat across from him in the same restaurant where Warren Foley had photographed his meetings with Danny, and I asked him to tell me everything. What Michael described was a partnership born of genuine innovation and mutual respect. Danny had reached out to him 18 months before the Hartwell debacle, intrigued by some articles Michael had published about emerging supply chain technologies. They'd started meeting, brainstorming, developing a framework that could transform how companies manage their logistics. The payments to Nexus were fees for Michael's consulting services, properly invoiced and properly delivered. The secrecy, Michael explained, was Danny's idea. He'd wanted to develop the concept fully before presenting it, wanted to surprise the company with a complete package rather than an unfinished idea. He'd been planning a presentation for the spring board meeting, a presentation that never happened because I'd had him removed 2 months earlier. As for the connection to Hartwell, Michael explained that his previous employment there was coincidental and irrelevant. He'd left Hartwell years before our engagement began. He had no ongoing relationship with anyone involved in their procurement decisions. The fact that I'd connected these dots was evidence of my own paranoia, not of any actual conspiracy. When I left that restaurant, I sat in my car for 45 minutes, unable to drive. The full weight of what I'd done settled over me like a physical force. I'd destroyed my best friend. I'd stolen everything from him. And I'd done it not because of anything he'd done, but because of my own fear, greed, and suspicion. The guilt that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced. I'd felt guilt before, small guilts, manageable guilts, the kind that fade with time and rationalization. This was different. This was a complete reassessment of who I'd believed myself to be. I'd built my identity around being ethical, being trustworthy, being the kind of person who did the right thing even when it was hard. Now I had to confront the reality that I was capable of profound cruelty, that I had exercised that capacity against someone who'd done nothing to deserve it, and that I'd spent years lying to myself about what I'd done. I started having trouble sleeping. I lost weight. My concentration deteriorated. The company I'd fought so hard to control became a burden I could barely carry. Every success felt hollow. Every award, every accolade, every industry recognition, they all reminded me of Danny, of what he'd contributed, of what he should have been sharing. My marriage, which had been deteriorating since long before my confrontation with Danny, finally collapsed. Catherine had sensed something wrong for years, had watched me become harder, more secretive, more consumed by work. She'd tried to reach me, tried to understand what was happening, but I'd pushed her away, had wrapped myself in the fortress of my lies until there was no room left for intimacy or truth. When she asked for a divorce, I didn't fight it. I couldn't. Fighting would have required explaining, and explaining would have meant confronting what I'd done. It was easier to let her go, to add that loss to the pile of consequences I was accumulating. I thought about reaching out to Danny. I thought about it constantly. I drafted emails I never sent, typed phone numbers I never called, composed letters I couldn't bring myself to mail. What would I say? How do you apologize for systematically destroying someone's life based on suspicions that turned out to be completely unfounded? How do you ask forgiveness for a betrayal so comprehensive that it touches every aspect of a person's existence? Part of me was afraid Danny would reject my apology, that he'd be angry, that he'd demand justice I couldn't provide, that he'd make me feel even worse than I already did. But the deeper fear was different. I was afraid he'd forgive me. I was afraid he'd be gracious and understanding, that he'd absolve me with the same generosity of spirit he'd always shown, and that I'd have to live with that forgiveness while knowing I didn't deserve it. The paralysis lasted for more than a year. I continued running Meridian on autopilot, making decisions without caring about their outcomes, attending meetings without hearing what was said. My leadership team noticed the change. Our performance suffered. I didn't care about any of it. What finally broke through my paralysis was a phone call from Danny's daughter, Claire. She was 23 by then, a young woman I'd watched grow up, whose childhood birthdays I'd attended, whose college graduation gift I'd chosen with genuine affection. She'd gotten my number from mutual friends and called one evening without warning. Danny was sick, she told me. Cancer. Stage 4. The doctors weren't optimistic. I don't know what I said in response. I remember sounds coming out of my mouth, expressions of shock and concern. I remember promising to help in whatever way I could, asking if there was anything I could do. Claire was polite but distant, and I understood that she'd called me not because she wanted my help, but because she'd felt obligated to let me know. Because however fractured our families had become, we'd once been close enough that such news deserved to be shared. After she hung up, I understood that I'd run out of time. Whatever I was going to do, whatever reckoning I was going to face, it couldn't wait any longer. Danny was dying, and if I didn't find a way to confront what I'd done, I'd carry this guilt not just through his life but beyond it. forever. I called Claire back the next morning and asked if Danny would be willing to see me. She said she'd ask, but couldn't promise anything. 2 days later, she called to say he'd agreed. I drove to Danny's house on a Thursday afternoon in late autumn. It was a modest home in a neighborhood I didn't recognize, nothing like the house he'd owned when we were partners, when his share of Meridian's success had provided a lifestyle appropriate to his contributions. He'd had to downsize after the settlement, had spent years rebuilding while I'd continued to prosper. The injustice of that contrast hit me as I parked my car, looked at the small yard, the older model vehicles, the life he'd been forced to build from the wreckage I'd created. Claire met me at the door. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, not hostile, but not welcoming either. She led me to a back bedroom where Danny was resting in a hospital bed that had been set up near the window. He'd lost weight, and his hair had thinned, and his skin had the papery quality of serious illness, but his eyes were the same. When he looked at me, I saw recognition and pain, and something else I couldn't immediately identify. I sat in a chair beside his bed, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Danny said, "You look terrible. Despite everything, despite the magnitude of what lay between us, despite the guilt that was choking me, despite the absurdity of the observation given his own appearance," I laughed. It was a strange, strangled sound, more like a sob than a laugh, but it broke something loose in my chest. "I am terrible," I said. "Danny, I need to tell you." He held up a hand. "I know what you're going to say. You don't have to." "I do. I have to. I can't." "Marcus." His voice was gentle, and that gentleness undid me more completely than anger ever could have. "I've known the truth for years. I've known what really happened, why you did what you did, what was actually going on in your head. I've had a lot of time to think about it." I stared at him, unable to speak. "You were wrong," he continued. "About everything. You know that now, right? You understand that I wasn't stealing, wasn't betraying you, wasn't doing any of the things you accused me of." "I know," I managed. "God, Danny, I know. I was so wrong. I was so completely, catastrophically wrong, and I destroyed your life because of it. I don't know how to—" "I'm going to tell you something," he interrupted, "and I need you to really hear it, okay? I need you to let it in, even though you won't want to, even though it's going to feel wrong." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I forgive you." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd imagined this moment, had feared it, and longed for it simultaneously. But hearing it spoken aloud, in Danny's weakened voice, in this small bedroom that represented everything I'd taken from him, it was more than I could process. "You can't," I said. "You can't forgive me. What I did, I can, and I do." Danny shifted slightly, wincing at some internal pain. "Not because you deserve it, Marcus. Not because what you did was okay, or understandable, or justifiable in any way. What you did was terrible. You stole my career, my reputation, my financial security. You made me look like a criminal. You took 20 years of partnership and friendship and trust, and you threw it away because you couldn't control your own paranoia." Each word landed like a blow, but I didn't look away. I owed him at least that much. "But here's what I've learned," he continued. "Forgiveness isn't really about the person who wronged you. It's about yourself. I spent years being angry at you, Marcus. Years of bitterness and resentment and fantasies of revenge. And you know what? It didn't hurt you at all. You went on with your life, running the company, building your success, completely untouched by my anger. The only person my bitterness was destroying was me." He paused, catching his breath. Claire appeared in the doorway, concerned, but Danny waved her away. "When I got sick," he said, "I had to make some choices about how I wanted to spend the time I had left, and I decided I didn't want to spend it hating you. I decided I wanted to remember the good years, the real friendship we had before everything went wrong. I decided I wanted to die at peace. Danny, so I forgive you, not for your sake, for mine. I'm letting go of the weight you put on me because I don't want to carry it anymore. What you do with that forgiveness is up to you." I was crying by then, tears streaming down my face in a way I couldn't control and didn't try to. "I don't know what to do with it," I admitted. "I don't know how to live with what I've done. I thought if I came here, if I apologized, if I heard you forgive me, I thought it would help. But it just makes it worse. You're better than I am, Danny. You've always been better than me. And I didn't just fail to see it, I punished you for it." Danny was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was tired but steady. "There is something you can do. Something that might help both of us. Anything. I'll do anything. Tell the truth." I looked at him, not understanding. "The settlement I signed included a non-disclosure agreement," he explained. "I wasn't allowed to talk about what happened, wasn't allowed to dispute the official narrative. You got to control the story. Everyone in our industry thinks I was a thief who got caught and paid a price. Everyone thinks you were the hero who protected the company." He met my eyes, and in his gaze I saw not anger, but a quiet, exhausted determination. "I'm dying, Marcus. In a few months, maybe less, I'll be gone, and the lie you created will outlive me. My daughter will grow up knowing that her father was publicly labeled a fraud. My grandchildren, if Claire has children someday, will inherit that story. That's the legacy you left me. Not the good work I did, not the company I helped build, but a lie that made me a villain." The weight of his words settled over me. "Tell the truth," he repeated. "Not privately, not quietly. Tell everyone. Tell the industry. Tell the people who worked with us, the clients we served, the friends we shared. Clear my name. Let me die with people knowing who I actually was." "I will," I said immediately. "I swear to you, Danny, I will tell everyone. I'll make it right." He smiled, and for a moment he looked almost like the man I remembered, the friend who'd driven through a snowstorm to sit with me, the partner who dreamed impossible dreams in my garage, the person I'd loved and betrayed and lost. "Good," he said. "That's good." I stayed for another hour, talking about things that didn't matter and things that mattered enormously. We talked about the early days, about the ridiculous struggles of building a company from nothing, about the clients we'd won and the mistakes we'd made. We talked about our children, about the ways they'd grown, about the pride and fear that came with watching them become adults. We talked about everything except the years of silence and separation, as if by focusing on what we'd been, we could briefly pretend the rest hadn't happened. When I left, I hugged him carefully, mindful of how fragile he'd become. He patted my back with a hand that had lost most of its strength. "Don't wait," he said. "Don't put it off. I want to see it. I want to know before I go that you kept your promise." I promised again, and this time I meant it. The following weeks were the most difficult of my professional life, but also the most necessary. I met with our board of directors and told them everything. I explained the real sequence of events, the paranoia that had driven my investigation, the ways I'd manipulated evidence and manufactured a crisis. I told them about the sabotage of the Hartwell contract. I told them about the settlement I'd coerced Danny into accepting. I held nothing back. They were, predictably, horrified. Several board members had been with the company since before the crisis and had accepted my version of events without question. Hearing the truth, from my own mouth, in my own words, shattered their confidence in me completely. I offered my resignation. They accepted it. I drafted a public statement that told the truth about what had happened to Danny Whitmore. I sent it to industry publications, to our major clients, to everyone who had been affected by the lie I'd created. I named myself explicitly as the wrongdoer, described my actions in unsparing detail, and asked for nothing except that Danny's reputation be restored. The reaction was swift and severe. I received hundreds of messages, from former colleagues, from industry contacts, from people I'd known for decades. Some expressed disappointment, some expressed fury. A few expressed a grudging respect for coming forward, though they made clear that respect didn't translate to forgiveness. My reputation, carefully built over 30 years, was effectively destroyed in a matter of days. I also received legal notices. The settlement agreement with Danny had included mutual releases, but my public admission of fraud and sabotage opened questions about whether those releases remained valid. Danny's lawyers reached out to discuss potential remedies. I instructed my own attorneys not to fight. The financial unwinding took months, but I'd already decided on the outcome. I calculated what Danny's true share of Meridian should have been, not based on the fraudulent valuation I'd forced him to accept, but on fair market terms that reflected his actual contributions. With interest and damages, the number was substantial. I liquidated most of my personal assets, including my stake in the company, to fund the settlement. When the final agreement was signed, Danny received more than he'd lost. Not as restitution for a crime, since statutes of limitation complicated any criminal case, but as a negotiated settlement acknowledging my wrongdoing. His daughter Claire called to tell me the funds had been received and that Danny was pleased. He died 3 weeks later. I learned about it from the obituary, which identified him as the co-founder of Meridian Solutions and a respected leader in supply chain innovation. His name had been cleared in the press by then, and the obituary reflected the truth. Not the lie I'd created, but the legacy he'd actually earned. I wasn't invited to the funeral. I understood why, and I didn't contest it. Some things can be forgiven without being forgotten. Some distances, once created, can never be fully bridged. The years since Danny's death have been a strange mixture of peace and penance. I'm not the same person I was, not the paranoid betrayer who destroyed his best friend, but also not the naive idealist who started a company in his garage 3 decades ago. I'm something in between, something shaped by failure and loss and a hard-won understanding of my own capacity for cruelty. I don't run companies anymore. I don't want that kind of power. Instead, I consult occasionally for nonprofits, help mediate business disputes, and spend most of my time alone with my thoughts. My relationship with my daughter has slowly improved, though she struggles to understand how her father could have done what I did to someone she'd grown up considering an uncle. My ex-wife and I speak occasionally, with a kind of exhausted fondness that acknowledges both what we lost and why we lost it. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if I'd made different choices. If I'd gone to Danny directly when Brian first raised questions about those payments. If I'd asked for an explanation before launching an investigation. If I'd examined my own suspicions with the same rigor I applied to building my case against him. If I'd remembered in those crucial moments that Danny was my friend before he was my rival, and that the rivalry existed only in my own mind. But those alternate histories don't exist. Only this one does. Only the choices I made and the consequences that followed. The lesson I carry isn't complicated, but it's hard. Trust is fragile. Suspicion is seductive. Once you start looking for evidence of betrayal, you'll find it everywhere, because the human mind is designed to confirm its fears. The only protection against that pattern is deliberate, uncomfortable honesty with others, but more importantly, with yourself. I betrayed Danny because I betrayed myself first. I abandoned my own values, my own principles, my own capacity for generosity and good faith. I let fear and greed rewrite my understanding of reality, and by the time I realized what I'd done, the damage was irreversible. The title I've given this confession, How I Cheated My Business Partner Out of Everything We Built, is accurate but incomplete. The full truth is worse. I didn't just cheat Danny. I cheated myself. I cheated the friendship we'd had. I cheated the company we'd created. I cheated the future we could have shared. Danny forgave me before he died. I'm still working on forgiving myself. I'm not sure I ever will. Maybe that's appropriate. Maybe some actions are meant to leave permanent marks, reminders of what we're capable of when we lose sight of what matters. What I know for certain is this: the truth matters, not just for the person who was wronged, but for the person who did the wronging. Carrying a lie changes you, distorts you, makes you into someone you don't recognize. The confession I've offered here, to whoever reads it, wherever it might land, isn't a request for absolution. It's an attempt to exist, finally, in reality. To stop pretending. To be seen as I actually am. Danny was the best friend I ever had. He was honest and creative and generous, and he trusted me completely. I took that trust and I crushed it. I used it as a weapon against him. And when he was dying, when he had every right to reject me and deny me closure, he offered me forgiveness instead. That forgiveness is the hardest thing I've ever received. It demands that I try to become someone worthy of it, even knowing I may never succeed. It demands that I tell this story, not as a justification, but as a warning. It demands that I live the rest of my life in truth, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be. So here I am, Marcus Brennan, 61 years old, once a successful entrepreneur, now a cautionary tale. A man who had everything and threw it away because he couldn't control his own fear. A man who destroyed his best friend and spent years pretending he hadn't. A man who finally told the truth, far too late to undo the damage, but perhaps not too late to matter. If you're reading this, if something in my story resonates with your own life, I have one piece of advice. Don't wait. Whatever suspicion you're nurturing, whatever fear is driving your decisions, whatever story you're telling yourself to justify actions you know are wrong, stop. Now. Before the damage becomes irreversible. Before the person you're hurting becomes someone you can never reach. Before you have to live with the knowledge that you were the villain all along. Danny gave me forgiveness. What I gave him, eventually, painfully, incompletely, was the truth. That exchange wasn't fair, wasn't balanced, wasn't proportionate to what I'd taken, but it was something. It was the only thing I had left to offer, and now I offer it to you. My confession, my truth, my hard-won understanding of what happens when a decent person makes indecent choices. I cheated my business partner out of everything we built together. I destroyed the best friendship of my life. I lived with the consequences for years before finding the courage to admit what I'd done. This is who I am. This is what I did. And this is my attempt, finally and forever, to stop hiding from it.